The ballroom was packed. Medals gleaming, cameras flashing. They were there to honor heroes, until one officer decided to humiliate her in front of everyone. He raised his hand. The crowd froze. But before he could move, the commanding officer stood up and said, "Stand down, Lieutenant. She outranks everyone here. If you believe respect isn't given, it's earned in silence. Keep watching." The ballroom inside Fort Meriden's command hall looked like it had been polished for a coronation. Brass plaques shone against the marble walls, the flags of every service branch hung in symmetrical order, and every uniform in sight looked freshly pressed, the air sharp with cologne and ceremony. It wasn't a night for war stories. It was a night for politics. Medals, cameras, speeches, and the quiet hum of ambition that always came with both. Captain Riley Hayes stood near the back, her posture straight, her expression calm. She'd been told to attend, not to speak. She preferred it that way. Her dress uniform was immaculate but plain. No rows of medals, no visible rank pins except the small silver bars on her collar. She looked like a background officer, one of the many who kept things running but never stood in front of the cameras. And that was exactly how she liked it. From her position, she could see everything. The brass, the photographers, the civilians in rented tuxedos trying to look comfortable around men and women who'd been shot at for a living. She could also see Lieutenant Mark Hensley, 2 tables away, already red-faced from champagne and arrogance. He was young, decorated, and too loud for the room. "Hayes," he said earlier that night, when he spotted her near the refreshments table. "Didn't think logistics officers got invitations to these things. Must be scraping the bottom of the roster." Riley had just smiled faintly. "They needed someone who can read the map, Lieutenant." He'd laughed, but there had been a flicker of something in his eyes. Irritation, maybe confusion. Now, as the master of ceremonies began his welcome speech, Riley folded her hands behind her back. "Tonight," the speaker declared, "we celebrate excellence, sacrifice, and leadership. The Medal of Valor recipients represent the finest traditions of the United States Armed Forces." Applause followed, camera flashes sparking across the room. Hensley's table erupted in laughter about something whispered, probably about her again. He didn't realize his voice carried when he'd been drinking. "She's here because her unit filled out the right forms. Paperwork heroes, that's what they are." The officer beside him chuckled nervously. "Careful, Mark." "What?" Hensley shrugged, leaning back. "You telling me she's done anything worth mentioning?" I checked her file. Logistics Division, 0 combat hours. She probably never left the base. Riley didn't turn, didn't react. That was the thing about silence. It unsettled men like him more than any argument ever could. At the head table, the commanding officer, Colonel James Porter, scanned the crowd from behind his glass of water. He saw everything, the behavior, the tension, the undercurrent. He'd known Riley Hayes for years. He also knew most of the people in this room had no idea who she really was. When the MC introduced him for his address, Porter rose. His uniform bore the weight of 4 decades, ribbons, commendations, and the quiet confidence of a man who'd been through enough to despise pomp. "Before we begin the awards," he said, "I want to remind everyone why we're here. Not just to hand out medals, but to honor those who serve without needing to be seen." His eyes lingered just for a second on Riley. Then he nodded to the staff sergeant by the stage. "Bring the first recipient forward." Lieutenant Hensley's name was called third. He strutted to the podium, polished and smiling, his medals glinting under the chandeliers. Cameras flashed. He gave a speech that sounded rehearsed, all about teamwork and courage, but the words rang hollow to those who'd ever been there for real. When he returned to his seat, his hand brushed Riley's shoulder as he passed. "Try not to fall asleep, Captain." Riley kept her gaze on the podium. "Trying not to, Lieutenant." Half an hour later, the program shifted. The MC read from the list again, hesitated, and looked up at the CO. Sir? We have one more name here," added last minute. "Captain Riley Hayes." A murmur rippled through the room. Riley's brow furrowed slightly. She hadn't been told about any recognition. The CO nodded. "That's correct. Bring her forward. Hensley laughed softly. What's this? Employee of the month. Riley ignored him and stepped out from her table. The heels of her boots echoed against the floor, the sound too sharp in a room suddenly too quiet. She approached the stage, stopped before Colonel Porter, and saluted. He returned the gesture, slow and deliberate. Captain Hayes, he said. This recognition is long overdue. She tilted her head slightly. Permission to ask what for, sir? For something that never made the paperwork, Porter said simply. The MC glanced at his notes, confused. Sir, there's no citation on record. That's because it's classified, Porter replied. A murmur spread through the crowd. Hensley chuckled. Oh, come on. Classified? What did she do? Fix the printer during a blackout. Laughter bubbled from one or two tables. The kind that tries to sound harmless but cuts deep. Porter's jaw tightened. Riley didn't move. Then Hensley stood, maybe to keep the joke going, maybe to prove something. You're telling us this desk officer's getting a medal for something no one's allowed to know? You're joking, right? Sit down, Lieutenant, Porter said calmly. But Hensley didn't. His face flushed darker. With all due respect, sir, this is ridiculous. We've got real combat officers in this room, and you're pinning medals on paper pushers? A few gasps, a few whispers. He took a step forward. Hell, if that's how it works, maybe next time she'll get promoted to Lieutenant, Porter warned again. General of paperwork. And that's when he moved his hand. Not much, just a gesture. But sharp enough that everyone in the front rows flinched. He looked like he might strike her. Riley didn't even blink. The silence cracked open. Lieutenant. The voice cut through the air like steel. Porter's tone had changed. He stepped down from the podium, closing the distance in 3 strides. Stand. Down. Hensley froze, hand still half raised. Porter stopped in front of him, his voice low enough for everyone to hear. She outranks everyone in this room. The words hit like a shockwave. Even Riley blinked. Porter turned toward the crowd. You want to know what she did? You'll find out soon enough. But for now, you will show her the respect she's earned. The entire ballroom went still. Riley didn't move, didn't speak. She just nodded once, to the colonel, to the silence, to everything that had led here. Then she turned and walked off stage, her steps calm, precise, measured. Behind her, the air felt heavier, like everyone had just seen something they didn't understand, but couldn't forget. After the ceremony, the air outside the hall felt thinner, cooler, as if the walls themselves had held their breath through everything that happened. The night sky over Fort Meriden was wide and clear, a navy-black canvas scattered with stars that seemed almost too calm for the tension that lingered inside. Riley Hayes walked across the courtyard, boots striking softly against the stone. She wasn't walking away in anger or pride, just quiet purpose, the same rhythm she had always carried. Behind her, the murmur of voices from the ballroom began to rise again, low at first, then sharp. What the hell was that about? Someone whispered. Outranks everyone here? What's that supposed to mean? She's a captain, right? The colonel's protecting her. Has to be. Riley heard them as she reached the steps, but she didn't turn. The words rolled off her like dust on her jacket. She had been through worse than gossip. Far worse. Inside the ballroom, Lieutenant Hensley sat frozen, staring at the empty stage. His pulse hadn't slowed since the colonel's voice hit him like a blast wave. Every pair of eyes that had once been laughing with him was now avoiding his. He tried to smile, tried to shrug it off. Guess I crossed a line. Huh? But no one laughed back. The air felt cold around him. Colonel Porter remained at the podium, hands folded behind his back. The crowd was still confused, uneasy, but the colonel's stare made it clear that the discussion was over. His voice was calm when he dismissed the assembly, but his tone left no space for interpretation. That will be all for tonight. Dismissed. As people began to file out, snippets of conversation followed like echoes, rumors forming in real time. She must have been special ops. No logistics. I checked the manifest last year. Maybe she's got clearance above our pay grade. One of the younger lieutenants, a woman named Carter, shook her head. You don't get that kind of reaction from a commanding officer over paperwork. He said she outranks everyone. That means something deeper. Outside, Riley had already reached the parking lot. The lot lights painted her shadow long across the asphalt. She stopped beside her truck, leaned against the door, and took a slow breath. The smell of jet fuel from the nearby airfield drifted faintly through the air. It reminded her of somewhere else. Another night, years ago, under a sky that burned instead of shimmered. The colonel found her there 10 minutes later. He didn't speak at first, just stood beside her, hands in his pockets, looking out at the distant runway lights. The silence between them was familiar, comfortable. You handled that well, he finally said. Riley's voice was steady. Wasn't sure what you wanted me to do, sir. You didn't exactly send a memo. Porter chuckled lightly. Didn't think I'd have to. He turned to face her. You knew this would happen eventually, didn't you? Someone always pushes too far. She looked at him, eyes calm but tired. I just didn't think it'd be in front of 100 people and a film crew. You were trained for worse, he said. That was a long time ago. He nodded slowly. It still shows. They stood there another moment, the night wind brushing against the edges of their uniforms. Porter studied her face, the quiet discipline in her expression, the stillness that could only come from someone who had seen chaos and learned to live beside it. I meant what I said, Porter murmured. You do outrank them, every single one of them. They just don't understand what that means yet. Riley smiled faintly, a sad kind of smile. Respect isn't a rank, sir. It's a habit. Some people just don't learn it. Some people, Porter said, need to be reminded who built the habit for them. Her eyes drifted back toward the hall, where laughter was beginning to return. Uneasy, brittle laughter that hid confusion and embarrassment. She could already imagine the stories they'd tell. The rumors. Maybe that she was part of some classified division. Maybe that she'd saved the colonel's life once. Maybe something wilder. None of them would ever guess the truth. When Porter finally left, she remained there for a while longer, staring at the reflection of the runway lights in her truck window. In the glass, she could see herself, older than she felt, younger than the years in her memory allowed her to be. The field jacket had faded over time, but the faint scar along her collarbone hadn't. Neither had the tattoo just under her wrist. A simple set of numbers, coordinates. They pointed to a valley, a place she never spoke about, a place that, for a very long time, didn't officially exist. That night, long after the fundraiser ended and the ballroom lights dimmed, Riley sat on the edge of her bed in the officers' quarters, the faint hum of the air conditioner filling the quiet. She reached for the envelope she'd brought, the same one she'd carried under her arm all evening. Inside were only two things, a folded photograph and a medal, tarnished and unpolished. The photograph showed a group of 6 soldiers, dusty and grinning, standing in front of a half-burned helicopter in a desert that didn't match any known map. One of them was Riley, younger, dirt-streaked, eyes the same. On the back, in smudged ink, was written, "For the ones who never came back. K." She ran her thumb over the edges of the medal, tracing the scratches. It wasn't one of the official awards that came with speeches and flags. This one had been handed to her in silence by a man who hadn't survived the week after. The hum of the base generator outside reminded her of the rhythm of rotor blades. For a second, she could almost hear it again. The sound of engines over the desert, the radio static, the voice that had once said, "We can't hold. You need to pull out now." But she hadn't. She'd stayed, and 6 men had lived because of it. When she finally lay down, the base lights flickered once, then went dark for a moment as the backup systems cycled. Riley closed her eyes and breathed in the silence. Tomorrow, she knew, they'd whisper more. Someone would dig through old records, ask around, try to find out why the colonel had said what he did. They'd find nothing. The files were gone, the mission sealed, the truth buried where it belonged. And that was fine, because for people like Riley Hayes, recognition had never been the point. Survival was. Duty was. And tonight, she had simply been reminded that no matter how long you disappear into the quiet, the past always remembers your name. By morning, Fort Meriden was buzzing like a kicked hornet's nest. The fundraiser incident had spread faster than any official report. People who hadn't even been in the room now claimed they had seen it. The colonel tore him apart in front of everyone. She froze him with just a look. He actually tried to hit her. The story changed depending on who told it, but the ending was always the same. The commanding officer had defended Captain Riley Hayes with a sentence that still echoed through the halls. She outranks everyone here. Lieutenant Hensley didn't sleep. He spent the night pacing his quarters, every thought a cycle of humiliation and disbelief. He could still hear the laughter. Not at his joke, but at him, and the sharp silence that followed when Porter's voice cut through. By dawn, his anger had settled into something colder. Resolve. He wanted answers, and if he couldn't get them through the normal channels, he'd force them out another way. At 0800, the officers gathered in the briefing room for the daily operations update. The air smelled of burnt coffee and paper. Rows of metal chairs faced the front where a whiteboard listed patrol rotations, supply requests, and training schedules. Riley was there early, as always reviewing maintenance reports. She didn't look tired, though she hadn't gone home until nearly midnight. Her uniform was clean, her hair tied back, every movement precise, unhurried. When Hensley entered, the room shifted slightly, conversations tapering off, a few eyes flicking between the two of them. He walked straight past his seat, stopping near where she stood. "Captain," he said, his voice smooth but loud enough for the others to hear. "You've got a minute?" Riley looked up briefly. "Make it quick, Lieutenant." He smirked. "Oh, I'll make it quick. I've been hearing some interesting things since last night. People saying you outrank everyone. That true?" Her gaze stayed level. "You heard the colonel." "Yeah, I did," he said. "I just didn't realize we were running a secret monarchy around here. You mind explaining how a logistics officer gets a colonel to cover for her in front of an entire base?" The room went still. A few officers exchanged uneasy looks. Riley's tone was calm. "You're out of line, Lieutenant." "Am I?" Hensley stepped closer. "Because it looked a lot like favoritism. Maybe you've got something on him. Or maybe—" "Watch your next word," she said quietly. That tone, steady, precise, dangerous, made even the clock on the wall sound louder. Hensley hesitated for half a breath but couldn't stop himself. "Maybe you're not even supposed to be here." Riley didn't move. "You done? Not until you tell everyone what gives you the right to stand there and act like you're better than." The door opened behind him. Colonel Porter stepped in, holding a file under one arm. "Lieutenant," he said evenly, "you're done." Hensley stiffened, trying to compose himself. "Sir, I was just asking a question." Porter closed the door. "No, you were trying to start a fight." The colonel set the file down on the table. Everyone else dismissed. The officers filed out in silence. Some shot worried glances back. Others just looked relieved. When the door shut, the room felt heavier. Porter looked between them. "Lieutenant Hensley, sit." "I'd rather stand, sir." "Then stand quietly." Porter turned to Riley. "You all right, Captain?" "Yes, sir." Hensley laughed once, sharp and bitter. "Of course she's all right. She's untouchable." Porter's voice didn't rise, but something in it tightened. "You're about 2 sentences away from a court-martial, Lieutenant." Hensley's jaw worked. "Then tell me, sir, why? Why does she get special treatment? What the hell makes her so important?" Porter studied him for a moment, then said quietly, "You want the truth?" "Yes, sir." "All right." He opened the file on the table. The pages inside were mostly blacked out, redacted lines like scars. He slid one across to Hensley. "Recognize that report?" Hensley frowned. "No, sir. You wouldn't. It's from Operation Shepherd's Gate. Afghanistan, 2015. I wasn't even." "No, you weren't," Porter cut in. "You were still at Quantico. Captain Hayes wasn't. She was forward deployed with the 21st Airborne, under a different name. Riley looked away, jaw tightening. Porter continued. That operation was supposed to be a simple retrieval. Turned into a bloodbath. Her bird was shot down 12 clicks from base. She pulled 5 wounded men out under fire, took command when her CO was killed, and held position for 9 hours until extraction. When command finally reached them, she refused to leave until the last casualty was loaded. Hensley blinked. That's not in any record. No, Porter said softly, because the mission was classified, and because she asked it to stay that way. Riley finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. Those men died anyway, sir. The mission didn't need headlines. Porter nodded slowly. You see, Lieutenant, she doesn't wear her medals because she doesn't need to. She doesn't talk about rank because the kind she earned isn't printed on a chart. It's written in the ground where her team fell. The silence that followed was suffocating. Hensley's eyes flicked between them, his face pale. For the first time, his voice dropped. Why didn't anyone know? Because, Riley said, real soldiers don't keep score. She turned toward the door. Porter didn't stop her. When she was gone, Porter faced Hensley again. You've got potential, Mark. You're smart. But you're not ready to lead until you learn what respect looks like. I don't care how many ribbons you wear. If you don't understand that, you'll never outrank anyone worth following. Hensley swallowed hard. Yes, sir. Porter's expression softened just slightly. You don't need to apologize to me. He hesitated. Then to who, sir? Porter nodded toward the door. You already know. Hensley stood there long after the colonel left, staring at the empty room. The file folder still lay open on the table. Across the redacted pages, a few words remained unblacked. Fragments of a name, a date, a single handwritten note in the margin. Mission integrity preserved. Operative designation. Raven. He closed the file carefully, his hands shaking just a little. Outside the window, the sunlight hit the base in sharp white stripes, glinting off hangars and helmets and the glass of the command tower. Everything looked the same, routine, orderly, normal, but for the first time since joining the military, Lieutenant Mark Hensley realized how much of the truth lived behind silence. And for the first time, he understood that respect wasn't something you demanded. It was something that, if you were lucky, you might be allowed to witness. 2 days later, Fort Meriden was wrapped in the kind of tension that everyone could feel but no one dared name. The fundraiser was still being whispered about, the story retold in quiet corners of the mess hall. Some said Captain Hayes was part of an experimental flight unit. Others claimed she'd been demoted after something classified went wrong. Whatever the version, one thing had changed. People moved aside when she passed now. Not out of fear, but out of something heavier. Respect laced with curiosity. Riley didn't seem to notice. She did what she always did, early mornings, precise reports, calm efficiency. The field jacket she sometimes wore off duty still looked like it didn't belong in a polished base. But somehow, she did. There was a steadiness about her that made even the noise of the hangar feel quiet. Lieutenant Hensley hadn't spoken to her since the confrontation. He tried, walked past her office twice, stopped outside once, but the words never came. He didn't know what apology would mean anything to someone like her. He didn't even know what she wanted him to say. Every time he saw her, she seemed like a reminder of everything he didn't understand about real leadership. That morning, the senior staff gathered in the command conference room. The air conditioning hummed softly, a faint vibration against the sound of shuffling papers. Colonel Porter stood at the front, hands behind his back, eyes on the digital map projected across the wall. Satellite reports show a transport convoy went dark 20 minutes outside the perimeter, he said. Comms failure or interference. Either way, we're blind. The logistics officer frowned. Was it carrying munitions? Medical supplies? 2 vehicles? 1 escort Humvee. Porter's jaw tightened. They should have checked in 20 minutes ago. Riley leaned forward slightly. Terrain. Dry basin. Old mining road. No satellite cover for 5 clicks. A ripple of unease passed through the room. Everyone knew what that meant. No signal, no visibility, and a long stretch of road that insurgents had used before. Porter exhaled. I want eyes on it fast. Lieutenant, prep a recon team. Hensley stood automatically. Yes, sir. Before he could move, Riley spoke. Permission to accompany, sir. The room turned. It wasn't a request anyone expected. Porter's gaze met hers. For a second, something unspoken passed between them, a calculation, maybe, or understanding. Then he nodded once. Granted. Hensley looked from one to the other. Sir, with all due respect, this is a recon op. Porter didn't look at him. You'll want her there, Lieutenant. The briefing ended quickly after that. Within 30 minutes, the team rolled out, dust spiraling behind their vehicles as they cut through the open desert. The sun was already punishing, heat waves bending the horizon into a trembling mirage. Hensley drove the lead Humvee, jaw tight, eyes scanning the road ahead. Riley sat beside him, calm, focused. The silence between them wasn't cold anymore, just heavy. He glanced at her once. You didn't have to come. I know, she said. He hesitated. You don't even carry a rifle. I carry what I need. That was the end of it. They hit the basin 15 minutes later. Narrow valley walls, the road cutting like a scar through sand and rock. The second vehicle followed close behind, dust clouding its windshield. The radio crackled once, then went dead. Comms interference, Hensley muttered. Just like the colonel said. Then he saw it, black smoke, thin but unmistakable, curling upward from behind a ridge. He pressed the accelerator. Contact, 12 o'clock. When they rounded the bend, the scene unfolded like a photograph burned into motion. The convoy was there, 2 transports overturned, 1 smoldering. The Humvee lay on its side, wheels still spinning slowly. Figures moved among the wrecks, not friendly. Ambush! Hensley shouted. Take cover! Gunfire cracked through the air. The rear vehicle screeched to a halt, soldiers diving out, returning fire. Riley had already moved, calm, fast, eyes locked on the terrain. She wasn't panicking, not even when bullets shredded the sand around them. Hensley ducked behind the front bumper, shouting into the dead radio. Command, this is Recon 1, we've got contact. Nothing. Static. He looked over. Riley was already moving toward the transport, low and deliberate. Captain, get back. She didn't. Her steps were quick, precise, weaving through dust and echo. A man inside the overturned truck was shouting, wounded. She dropped to one knee beside the door, checking his pulse, then looked up toward Hensley. Cover me. He didn't even think, just moved. The others followed, laying suppressing fire. The next minute blurred into sound and grit and adrenaline. When the firing slowed, Riley dragged the wounded man clear, his uniform torn and dark with blood. She tore a strip from her sleeve, tied it around his leg with mechanical precision, then pressed his hand. Stay with me. Captain, Hensley called again. We have to move. They're flanking left. She lifted her head, eyes narrowing. I see them. She grabbed a flare from her belt, twisted it, and tossed it over the ridge. For a second, the desert flashed red, and then the echo of rotor blades rolled over the valley. Hensley blinked. Is that extraction? She said simply. He looked up, disbelief breaking across his face. 2 Apache gunships swept low over the ridge, dust exploding around them. Their missiles hit with surgical precision, cutting the ambush off completely. The sound was deafening, like thunder from the sky itself. When the dust settled, Riley was still kneeling beside the wounded soldier, steadying his breathing. Her hair was coated with grit, her face streaked, but her hands didn't shake. Hensley stood there, heart hammering, unable to find words. How the hell did you? Riley looked up at him, eyes calm. I keep a few numbers that still answer when they see mine. They rode back in silence. The medevac team took the injured as soon as they reached the base. Porter was waiting by the gate, expression unreadable. When Riley stepped out, he nodded once. Report. Convoy secure, she said. 1 wounded, stable. Good work, he said. His tone was quiet, but his eyes said more than his words ever could. Hensley stood beside her, dirt still clinging to his uniform. He opened his mouth, closed it, then finally said, "Sir, permission to speak freely." Porter raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead." Hensley looked at Riley, then back at the colonel. "I was wrong, sir." His voice was low, rough. "She didn't just outrank us. She saved us. Again." Porter's jaw eased slightly. "Then learn from it." Riley said nothing. She just looked out toward the horizon where the helicopters had vanished. The sky clear and silver blue again. That night, word of what happened spread through the base. No one laughed this time. No one whispered. They just stopped when she walked past, nodded slightly, and let the silence speak for them. Because sometimes, respect doesn't start with an order. It starts when a room full of soldiers realizes that the quietest person among them is the one keeping them alive. And from that day forward, no one at Fort Meriden ever called her just logistics again. The report of the ambush made it through the command channels by dawn. But by then, the real story had already traveled faster than paper. Every barracks, every hallway, every break room carried the same version. Captain Hayes had saved the convoy when comms went down, and somehow, she'd called in air support from a frequency no one else could access. Officially, it wasn't possible. Unofficially, it was all anyone talked about. Riley didn't seem to notice the attention. After submitting her debrief, she returned to the hangar like nothing had happened. Sleeves rolled up, tools in hand. Her coveralls still carried dust from the valley, but her mind was already on engine diagnostics and fuel line calibrations. The soldiers who passed her nodded respectfully now. Some even saluted. She acknowledged them with a small nod, then went back to work. Lieutenant Hensley, on the other hand, couldn't let it go. He'd replayed the moment in the basin 100 times. The flare, the timing, the gunships that seemed to appear out of nowhere. None of it made sense. And the way Porter had spoken about her during that confrontation still echoed in his head. She doesn't wear her medals because she doesn't need to. That night, long after the hangars closed and the floodlights dimmed, he found himself outside the command office. The door was cracked open. Colonel Porter was still inside, paperwork spread across the desk, glasses low on his nose. "Sir," Hensley said from the doorway. Porter looked up, tired but alert. "You're still awake, Lieutenant." "Yes, sir. I need to ask something." Porter gestured toward the chair. "I figured you would." Hensley hesitated before sitting. "It's about Captain Hayes." "Of course it is." Porter closed the folder in front of him. "You want to know who she really is?" Hensley nodded. Porter leaned back in his chair, eyes distant for a moment. "Do you know how long she's been in uniform?" "No, sir." 17 years. Not that you'd find that anywhere. Half of her service records under a different name, Captain Riley Kane. She was reassigned under Hayes after Shepherd's Gate. "That operation again," Hensley said. "Everyone keeps mentioning it, but there's nothing in the archives." "There wouldn't be," Porter said. "It wasn't supposed to happen." He stood, walked to the window, and looked out over the base lights flickering like fireflies against the night. Shepherd's Gate was a humanitarian escort. Simple. Move supplies through a corridor we thought was secure. Then everything went wrong. Intel was bad. They were ambushed halfway through. The command post lost comms. We thought the entire unit was gone. Hensley leaned forward. "But they weren't." "No," Porter said quietly. "Because she refused to die there." He turned, eyes sharp. "She took command after her CO was killed. The pilot was down, engines burning. They were pinned for hours. She ran out of ammo and still held the position long enough for reinforcements to locate them. When they found her, she was half-conscious, dehydrated, and still guarding 2 wounded men with a sidearm she'd fired dry. The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioner. Hensley swallowed hard. Why was it classified? Porter's expression darkened. Because she disobeyed orders. Headquarters told her to withdraw. She didn't. She stayed until her team was out, and she nearly didn't make it herself. Command doesn't like stories where heroes break protocol. So they buried it, sealed the files. She took the blame, accepted reassignment to logistics, and never said a word about it. Hensley's voice was barely a whisper. She lost everything. She lost everyone, Porter corrected, and she never asked for it back. He walked back to the desk, pulled open a drawer, and took out a small envelope, yellowed with age. This came in the week after Shepherd's Gate. It was addressed to her, but the sender didn't make it home. I kept it until she was ready. He handed it to Hensley. The name on the front was faded but legible. Captain Riley Kane. Hensley hesitated. Sir, why are you giving this to me? Because she won't open it, Porter said. And I think you need to know what kind of person you tried to humiliate in that ballroom. When Hensley returned to his quarters, he sat at his desk under the dim desk lamp, turning the envelope over in his hands. The paper felt fragile, worn by time and heat. He broke the seal carefully. Inside was a single page, written in rushed but steady handwriting. Riley, if you're reading this, I didn't make it. Don't carry that. You did your job. You kept us alive. We never followed you because of your rank. We followed you because when everything went to hell, you were still there. That's leadership. The kind you can't fake and you can't teach. If they ever forget what you did, that's on them, not you. Kellen. The signature hit him like a blow. Kellen Monroe, the name from the mission roster in the classified file. He'd been her co-pilot, listed Kia. Hensley stared at the letter for a long time. Then he folded it carefully, returned it to the envelope, and just sat there. The base outside was silent, only the faint rumble of aircraft engines in the distance. He felt smaller than he ever had before. The next morning, he found Riley in the hangar, inspecting an Apache rotor assembly. She didn't look up when he approached. Something you need, Lieutenant? He hesitated. I owe you more than an apology. You don't owe me anything, she said, still focused on the rotor. Then at least let me say it. He took a breath. I didn't know. About Shepherd's Gate. About Kellen. Any of it. That made her pause. She looked at him, eyes sharp. Who told you that name? The colonel gave me a letter. Said it was time someone else knew. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she set down the wrench, wiped her hands, and leaned against the side of the chopper. He shouldn't have given you that. I think he wanted me to understand what rank really means, Hensley said quietly. Riley's gaze softened. Rank doesn't mean much when you're the last one standing. He nodded. I read what Kellen wrote. He wasn't talking about medals. No, she said. He never did. They stood there for a while, the hangar doors open to the morning light. The sound of engines outside carried in waves, steady and familiar. Finally, Hensley said, For what it's worth, Captain, I'd follow you anywhere. Riley gave a small smile, tired, but real. Let's hope you never have to. When he left, she pulled the envelope from her pocket, the same one she'd carried for years but never opened. For a long time, she just held it, the edges soft from being handled too many times. She didn't read it. She didn't have to. She already knew every word by heart. She slipped it back into her jacket, zipped the pocket shut, and looked out at the tarmac. The wind stirred the dust into small spirals that caught the sunlight, swirling like memories that refused to fade. Inside the command office, Colonel Porter watched her through the glass. There was pride in his eyes, but also something else. The weight of knowing some heroes never heal, they just learn to live with what they saved. And though no one said it out loud, every person on that base knew that from that day on, if Captain Riley Hayes walked into a room, silence would follow. Not because of fear or confusion, but because silence was the only thing that felt worthy. The order came quietly, just like everything else that had to do with Captain Riley Hayes. There was no press release, no reporters, no mention on the base bulletin. Just a short notice posted outside the command office. Personnel formation, 1800 hours, command hall. By evening, the hall was half full. Soldiers, officers, mechanics, medics, even the cooks from the mess hall all came. No one had been told what the gathering was for, but everyone already knew. Riley stood near the back again, the same spot where she'd stood during the fundraiser weeks earlier. Her uniform was clean but plain. The faded field jacket wasn't regulation, but she wore it anyway, the fabric soft with age and dust. She didn't expect to be called forward. She never did. The stage lights were softer this time. No glittering banners, no champagne, just rows of chairs and a podium at the center. Colonel Porter stood behind it, his face unreadable. He waited for the murmurs to fade before he spoke. "Some of you know why you're here," he said. "Most of you don't. But you've all earned the right to witness this." He paused, looking out across the room. A few weeks ago, this base saw something rare, the kind of leadership that doesn't ask for attention, doesn't demand credit, and doesn't need applause. The kind that exists quietly and shows itself only when everything else falls apart. His voice carried through the hall, low and steady. "Tonight, we're recognizing one of our own. Someone who has carried more than her share without ever once asking for recognition. Captain Riley Hayes, front and center." The room went still. Every head turned. Riley hesitated, but Porter's nod was firm. She walked forward, boots echoing softly across the polished floor. The weight of eyes on her shoulders didn't feel like judgment this time. Felt like understanding. When she reached the front, Porter stepped down from the podium. In his hands was a small box, plain, unmarked. "This isn't on the official record," he said quietly. "It never will be. But it belongs to you." He opened the box. Inside was a single medal, silver dulled by time, the ribbon slightly frayed. It wasn't new, wasn't ceremonial. It was the one she'd earned years ago and never accepted. Riley looked at it, then at him. "I told you I didn't want it, sir." Porter smiled faintly. "It's not about what you want. It's about what you deserve." He pinned it to her uniform himself, slow and deliberate, the soft click of metal catching against the fabric the only sound in the hall. Then he stepped back and saluted. First, it was just him. One officer standing at attention, hand raised in solemn respect. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the entire hall rose. The sound of boots scraping against the floor filled the silence. 100 people standing straight, eyes forward, hands raised. No one spoke. No one clapped. The silence was deeper than any applause could have been. Riley didn't move for a long moment. Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to breathe evenly. When she finally returned the salute, the gesture was simple, steady, the same way she had led, the same way she had survived. When Porter lowered his hand, he leaned in just enough for her to hear. "They needed this," he said quietly. "Not you. Them. To remember what real strength looks like." She nodded once, voice barely above a whisper. "Understood, sir." As she turned to leave the stage, her eyes caught Hensley's. He stood at the far end of the front row, posture straight, expression solemn. When she passed, he didn't speak, just saluted, hand trembling slightly. Riley paused, met his eyes, then gave a small nod. It was enough. Outside, the evening air was cool. The base lights glowed pale against the horizon, the hum of distant generators steady and familiar. She walked toward the motor pool, the metal glinting faintly against her chest with each step. Behind her, the hall doors opened. Hensley jogged to catch up, falling into step beside her. "You didn't have to let them do that," he said. "I didn't," she replied. "The colonel did." He smiled faintly. "You hate ceremonies, don't you?" "Always have." They walked in silence for a few moments, the gravel crunching under their boots. Finally, Hensley said, "For what it's worth, ma'am, I told everyone what you did out there. In the basin." She stopped, looked at him. "You shouldn't have." "Why not?" "Because it's not the story that matters," she said softly. "It's what people do with it." He nodded, understanding more than he could say. "You think they'll remember?" "They'll remember the silence," she said. "That's enough." When she reached her quarters, she unpinned the medal and set it on the desk beside the old envelope. The light from the lamp caught both at the same angle, making the medal and the paper look like two halves of the same history, one written in action, the other in memory. She sat for a while, hands clasped loosely in front of her, listening to the faint sounds of the base at night. A truck engine idling, footsteps, distant laughter from the barracks. Life moving on as it always did. There was a knock at the door. Porter stepped in without waiting for an answer. "You didn't stay long," he said. "I've had enough speeches for a lifetime." He smiled. "You know, for someone who hates attention, you sure attract a lot of it." "Not on purpose." "No," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "That's what makes it real." He looked at the medal on her desk. "You keeping it this time?" "Maybe," she said. "Maybe not." He nodded, then looked around the small, orderly room. "You ever think about teaching?" She raised an eyebrow. "Teaching?" "Yeah. Training the next generation. Passing it on." Her gaze drifted toward the window, where the lights of the runway shimmered in the distance. "Maybe someday, but not yet." Porter smiled knowingly. "Fair enough." He straightened, gave her one last nod, and left. When the door closed, Riley looked back at the medal again. The ribbon caught the lamplight, throwing a faint silver reflection across the desk. She reached out, turned it over, and on the back, engraved so small it was almost invisible, were the words, "For those who led in silence." She traced the letters with her thumb, then placed it back in the box. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of helicopters returning to base. She listened until it faded, then turned off the light. The room fell quiet, but somewhere in that stillness, you could almost hear it. The echo of 100 boots hitting the floor in unison. A salute that didn't need words, a respect that would never fade. The orders came on a Wednesday morning. No fanfare, no announcement, just a sealed envelope slid under her door. Inside, a single sheet of paper. Reassignment optional. Honorably discharged upon request. The message was brief, respectful, and final, a door opening and closing at the same time. Riley sat on the edge of her bunk, reading it twice, though she already knew what it meant. She'd felt it coming for months. The slow rhythm of life on base no longer matching the pulse that had kept her moving for years. She wasn't being pushed out. She was being given a choice. And for the first time in her life, she didn't need to think about it. She folded the letter neatly, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it beside the metal box on her desk. Outside, the morning sun was sharp and clear, painting the airfield in shades of silver and blue. Helicopters shimmered in the distance like sleeping giants. Mechanics moved around them with the quiet rhythm of routine. Somewhere across the tarmac, she could hear Hensley's voice shouting instructions. Steady, confident. He was growing into the kind of officer she'd hoped he would become. That was enough. She packed light, a duffel bag, her field jacket, a few letters she'd never sent. The medal stayed on the desk. She paused once before leaving, eyes lingering on it. For years, she'd carried the memory of everything that medal represented. But now, leaving it behind felt right. Some things belonged to the past. Some things needed to stay as proof that the past was real. At the gate, Colonel Porter was waiting. He didn't wear his full uniform this time, just a flight jacket, coffee in hand, the look of someone who understood goodbyes too well. "You're really doing it," he said. "I am." He nodded slowly. "No regrets." "Plenty," she said with a faint smile. "Just none worth staying for." He chuckled. "You know, you could have taken a desk job. Training. Strategy. You'd have had a hell of a career." "I already did," she said. "I just don't need the paperwork to prove it." They stood there for a moment, neither moving. The base stretched out behind them. Hangars, barracks, the long sunlit runway where every mission began and ended. Porter took a slow sip of his coffee, then set it down on the guardrail. "You left your medal." "I know. You're not taking it?" She shook her head. "It was never really mine. It belonged to the people who didn't come back." Porter's voice softened. "You know, someday they'll declassify Shepard's Gate. People will find out what happened." Riley's gaze drifted toward the horizon. "Then I hope they tell it right." He nodded, eyes following hers. "They'll try. But stories like that, they usually find their way through people like Hensley. Through the ones who saw it with their own eyes." She smiled faintly. "He'll do fine." When the transport truck pulled up, Porter extended his hand. She took it firm and steady. "You did good, Riley," he said. Better than most ever will. Thank you, sir. He hesitated, then added quietly, You know, the bass feels different when you're around. Quieter. Calmer. Guess it'll be loud again soon, she said. He laughed softly. I hope so. We could use the noise. She released his hand, slung the duffel over her shoulder, and started walking. The sun caught her profile, a flash of silver against tan dust, her shadow long across the ground. Halfway to the truck, she stopped and turned back. Porter was still there, one hand on the railing, watching her go. She gave a small nod. Not a salute, not protocol, just acknowledgement. And he returned it, the same quiet respect they had shared since the beginning. As the truck rumbled down the base road, the wind pulled at the loose strands of her hair. The landscape unfolded. Open desert, dry air shimmering like heat ghosts, distant mountains cutting the horizon. The base grew smaller in the rearview mirror until it was just a glint of metal and memory. She leaned back, the rhythm of the engine steady beneath her feet. For the first time in years, she had nowhere to be, no orders to follow, no lives depending on her decisions. The quiet was strange. Not empty, but full in its own way. From her jacket pocket, she pulled the old envelope, Kellen's letter, creased from being opened too many times. She unfolded it slowly, tracing the handwriting again. The words still carried the same weight they had the first day she'd read them. If they ever forget what you did, that's on them, not you. She smiled softly and slipped it back inside. Hours later, when the truck stopped at the edge of a small rural town, she stepped out, squinting against the afternoon sun. A diner sat across the road, its neon sign flickering half-broken. The smell of coffee and frying oil drifted through the air. She walked toward it, her boots raising small clouds of dust. Inside, the place was almost empty. A waitress in her 40s wiped the counter, glanced up, and smiled politely. Coffee? Black, Riley said. The waitress poured a cup, set it down. You military? Riley hesitated, then nodded once. Used to be. The woman smiled knowingly. Thank you for your service. Riley just nodded again. Quietly. She sat there for a long time, watching the light change outside the window. A pair of teenagers laughed at a jukebox. A trucker counted change at the register. The world kept moving like it always did. When she finally stood to leave, she left a few bills on the counter and a folded note beneath the coffee cup. It was the reassignment letter and signed. The waitress never noticed. Outside, the sun was setting. The sky streaked in shades of copper and pale silver. Riley adjusted her duffel, looked down the highway stretching endlessly into the horizon, and started walking. No medals, no rank, no ceremony. Just the sound of her boots on the pavement, steady and certain. Back at Fort Meriden, Porter found the medal still sitting on her desk. He picked it up, turned it over in his hand, and read the engraving again. For those who led in silence. He placed it back down beside the folded uniform she'd left behind, then stood at attention. Alone in the quiet room, he raised his hand in a slow, deliberate salute. No one saw it. No one needed to. Outside, the wind carried the faint echo of rotor blades across the desert. A memory that refused to fade, a rhythm that belonged to her long after she was gone. Some people leave behind legacies written in ink. Others leave behind stories written in silence. Captain Riley Hayes never asked for either, but she left both. Some heroes don't leave medals behind. They leave silence, the kind that changes everyone who hears it. Captain Riley Hayes never chased rank, never sought attention, and never once raised her voice. But when the moment came, she led an entire base, a generation, and maybe even a country without saying a word. Because real strength doesn't shout. It simply stands, steady, unshaken, and unforgettable. And when she walked away, she didn't disappear. She became the kind of story that lives in the spaces between orders and memories, the kind every soldier hopes someone will tell about them one day. If you believe true leadership isn't about power, it's about purpose, type respect in the comments. And subscribe to Endless Stories, where we remember the quiet ones, the forgotten ones, the ones who never needed to be seen to change everything.